The vault of the Loomis Fargo regional office in Charlotte stood utterly silent under the cold fluorescent lights. It was a Sunday morning in October of 1997 when the first manager arrived to find the heavy steel doors wide open. There were no blaring alarms cutting through the autumn air and no shattered glass littering the polished concrete floor. The silence itself felt violently out of place for a facility designed to hold the wealth of an entire city. Instead of the expected mountains of securely wrapped currency pallets, a gaping void greeted the panicked eyes of the regional supervisor. More than $17 million in hard, untraceable American currency had simply vanished into the shadows of the North Carolina night. To comprehend the sheer magnitude of this theft requires understanding the physical weight of that much paper money. It was not a briefcase full of neatly stacked $100 bills that someone could slip into a getaway car. $17 million in mixed denominations weighs close to 2 tons. Moving that kind of massive bulk requires a forklift, a heavy-duty transport truck, and an immense amount of time. Yet the security cameras showed a terrifyingly calm and calculated operation that unfolded while the rest of the city slept. The FBI was immediately dispatched to the scene, expecting to find the intricate handiwork of a highly sophisticated, heavily armed international crime syndicate. Federal agents swarmed the sprawling compound, dusting every surface for microscopic fingerprints and analyzing the uncut perimeter fences. They anticipated uncovering a network of bypassed optical lasers and hacked digital encryption codes similar to the grand heists seen in Hollywood blockbusters. However, the bitter reality they discovered within those fortified walls was far more insulting to the state-of-the-art security system. The fortress had not been breached from the outside by a team of elite tactical professionals. The devastating truth was that the impenetrable fortress had been quietly unlocked from the inside. The meticulous investigation quickly zeroed in on a single missing element, a trusted vault supervisor named David Gaunt. He was a quiet, unassuming man, with a spotless record and a military background, who was supposed to be guarding the vault that very night. When investigators tried to contact him, his phone rang endlessly in an empty house, sending immediate red flags through the agency. David was gone, and so was the company armored truck he used for his daily routes. The immediate assumption was that a heavily armed gang had taken the mild-mannered supervisor hostage, forcing him to empty the secure reserves before disposing of him. Kidnapping a guard was a standard, albeit brutal, tactic used by organized crime families. Law enforcement agencies across the entire state of North Carolina initiated a massive manhunt, fearing the worst for the missing veteran employee. Helicopters chopped through the cloudy skies, while patrol cruisers scoured every highway leading out of the metropolitan area. The tension broke later that afternoon when a local police unit stumbled upon the missing armored Loomis Fargo truck. It was parked haphazardly at a small business complex miles away from the secure facility. Agents approached the massive vehicle with weapons drawn, anticipating a grisly crime scene hidden behind the reinforced steel doors. They breached the heavy rear doors, only to find the cavernous interior completely empty. There was no blood, no signs of a desperate struggle, and absolutely no trace of the missing $17 million. More alarmingly, there was no sign of David Gaunt. The narrative rapidly shifted from a tragic hostage situation to the realization of an inside job of unprecedented scale. The authorities had to face the unthinkable prospect that the quiet vault guard was the mastermind. News networks across the country immediately seized upon the sensational story of the missing millions. It became the largest cash robbery in the history of the United States up to that point. The public was instantly captivated by the audacious nature of the crime, wondering how a supposedly unshakable financial institution could be bled dry overnight. The mystery deepened with every passing hour as federal investigators dug aggressively into the personal life of the prime suspect. They expected to find a hidden life of crippling gambling debts or ties to shadowy underworld figures. What the FBI uncovered instead was a shockingly ordinary existence. David Gaunt was a man who lived paycheck to paycheck, completely devoid of any criminal history or mastermind inclinations. He was the absolute last person anyone would suspect of engineering a flawlessly executed heist of nearly 2 tons of Federal Reserve notes. The glaring contradiction baffled the sharpest minds in law enforcement. If David was not a criminal mastermind, then someone else had pulled the strings from the shadows. Someone had recognized his vulnerabilities and exploited his access to the most secure room in the city. The empty vault was merely the aftermath of a psychological manipulation that began long before the night of the robbery. To understand how $17 million disappeared into thin air, the investigators had to look beyond the stolen cash and examine the human heart. The true story of the Loomis Fargo heist is not just about a mountain of stolen money. It is a terrifying study of how an ordinary life can be derailed by a toxic mixture of misplaced loyalty and blinding greed. As the FBI began tracking a bizarre trail of newly purchased luxury cars and absurdly lavish spending, they realized they were not hunting a sophisticated cartel. They were dealing with a wildly unpredictable crew of dangerous amateurs. The mastermind behind the greatest cash heist in American history was not a seasoned thief. David Gaunt was a painfully ordinary man, trapped in a remarkably mundane existence. He was a military veteran who had traded his uniform for the drab attire of a Loomis Fargo vault supervisor. His days were measured by the monotonous clinking of coins and the rustling of shrink-wrapped cash pallets. He lived a quiet life with his wife in a modest suburban home. David felt utterly invisible in the massive machine of corporate security. He spent his nights surrounded by staggering wealth that he could never hope to touch. Every shift was a cruel reminder of his own financial struggles and the grinding reality of living paycheck to paycheck. He was a loyal employee who followed every rule and never questioned authority. This predictable compliance made him the perfect target for someone who knew exactly how to exploit human weakness. The catalyst for his spectacular downfall arrived in the form of a charismatic coworker named Kelly Campbell. She possessed a chaotic energy that completely disrupted the sterile environment of the vault. Kelly was everything David was not. She was bold, unpredictable, and entirely unbothered by company regulations. A subtle but dangerous flirtation blossomed between them amidst the towering stacks of Federal Reserve notes. David was hopelessly captivated by her rebellious spirit and intoxicating presence. Kelly eventually left her job at Loomis Fargo, but she did not leave David behind. She maintained contact and carefully nurtured his growing infatuation over casual phone calls and secret meetings. She listened to his complaints about feeling undervalued and overworked by the corporate system. Kelly recognized the deep well of resentment building inside the mild-mannered vault guard. She began to subtly plant the seeds of a wildly dangerous fantasy into his eager mind. Behind Kelly stood the true architect of the impending disaster. Steve Chambers was a petty criminal and a former high school classmate of Kelly, with grand delusions of immense wealth. He operated from a rusty trailer park, but envisioned himself as a ruthless cartel boss. Steve lacked the courage and the access to rob a bank himself. However, he possessed a predatory instinct for identifying easily manipulated individuals who could do the dirty work for him. Steve convinced Kelly to exploit her emotional hold over the love-struck vault guard. The pitch was incredibly simple yet dangerously intoxicating for a man desperate for change. They would relieve Loomis Fargo of its burdensome millions, and David would be the hero of his own story. They promised him a glamorous new life on the sun-drenched beaches of Mexico. All he had to do was open a door and load a truck. The psychological transformation of David Gaunt is a terrifying case study in vulnerability. The man who had sworn to protect the vault slowly began viewing the money as a ticket to his salvation. He stopped seeing the cash as company property and started viewing it as the key to winning Kelly forever. Steve Chambers remained completely hidden in the shadows, pulling the strings through Kelly while keeping his own hands meticulously clean. The planning phase was completely devoid of high-tech blueprints or sophisticated hacking equipment. The trio met in dingy diners and smoky living rooms to map out the logistics on scrap paper. David provided the crucial inside knowledge regarding camera blind spots and weekend skeleton crews. He explained exactly how much cash was held on any given night and the routine patrol schedules. The amateur syndicate was relying entirely on insider knowledge and sheer audacity. Their strategy was remarkably straightforward, but riddled with catastrophic long-term flaws. David was to empty the vault during his solo weekend shift and drive the armored truck to a transfer point. Steve and Kelly would then take the bulk of the cash, while handing David a small portion to flee the country. He was instructed to lay low in Cozumel until the intense federal heat eventually dissipated. It sounded like a foolproof cinematic escape. They completely ignored the crushing reality of international fugitive tracking and modern forensic science. None of them had ever laundered a single dollar, let alone 17 million. They possessed absolutely no concept of how the federal government hunts down stolen reserve currency. Their entire criminal enterprise was built on a foundation of blind optimism and staggering ignorance. Yet the gears of the disastrous heist were already in motion and could not be stopped. The night of October 4th descended upon Charlotte with an eerie stillness that masked the impending chaos. Inside the impenetrable walls of the Loomis Fargo depot, David Gant found himself completely alone for his designated weekend shift. The massive steel doors of the vault stood before him, guarding a staggering fortune that belonged to a faceless corporate entity. This was the precise moment of no return. He disabled the internal security recording devices with a practiced ease, leaving only a few external cameras active to maintain a facade of normalcy. The silence of the facility was deafening as he punched in the master codes and turned the heavy mechanical locks. The metallic groan of the vault door swinging open sounded like the opening bell of a heavyweight prize fight. He stepped into a cavernous room overflowing with unimaginable wealth. Millions of dollars sat stacked on wooden shipping pallets, tightly bound in industrial shrink wrap. Hollywood movies often portray bank robberies as swift and glamorous operations, involving sleek black bags and acrobatic escapes. The reality facing David was brutally physical and exhaustingly mundane. He was looking at nearly 2 tons of tightly packed paper currency that needed to be moved entirely by hand. Sweat immediately began to bead on his forehead as he wrestled a heavy pallet jack into the confined space of the vault. He systematically targeted the highest denominations, prioritizing the untraceable bundles of $20 and $100 bills. Every single pallet required immense physical exertion to maneuver out of the steel cage and across the loading dock. Time was ticking relentlessly towards dawn, and his muscles burned with every heavy load. He spent over an hour frantically loading the metallic belly of a designated company armored truck. The sheer volume of the stolen cash was overwhelming, filling the cargo bay to its absolute maximum capacity. He was quite literally surrounded by a mountain of stolen prosperity, yet he possessed no coherent plan for how to manage such a staggering physical footprint. The hardest part of the heist was not the breach, but the logistics. With the truck fully loaded, David climbed into the driver's seat and fired up the heavy diesel engine. He drove out of the secure compound, leaving the shattered illusion of corporate security in his rearview mirror. The deserted city streets flashed by in a blur of amber streetlights as he navigated towards a predetermined rendezvous point on the outskirts of town. He was carrying $17 million, and his heart pounded furiously against his ribs. Kelly Campbell and Steve Chambers were waiting in the shadows of an industrial park with a rented moving van. The atmosphere was incredibly tense as the amateur thieves hastily transferred the mountains of cash from the armored transport. There was no time to carefully count or organize the staggering fortune. They violently ripped open the protective plastic wrapping and threw the heavy bundles of cash into the back of their personal getaway vehicles. The original plan dictated that David would take a modest cut and immediately flee the country. They handed him a meager $50,000, a laughable fraction of the empire he had just stolen. Blinded by his infatuation and misplaced trust, David accepted the small bundle without a single protest. He genuinely believed that Kelly would secure the rest of his share and eventually join him on a sun-drenched beach. While Steve and Kelly drove away with enough cash to rival a small national treasury, David rushed toward the airport. He purchased a one-way ticket and boarded a commercial flight heading straight to Cozumel, Mexico. He sat in his economy seat, staring out the window as the plane ascended into the dark sky. The vault supervisor had successfully pulled off the impossible, transforming himself into an international fugitive before breakfast. As the morning sun slowly began to illuminate the skies over North Carolina, the true magnitude of their actions settled over the conspirators. They had successfully executed the largest cash heist in American history without firing a single weapon. However, their flawless execution inside the vault was about to be eclipsed by their catastrophic ineptitude in the real world. The real danger was not the heist itself, but the intoxicating aftermath. The tropical sun of Cozumel provided little comfort to David Gaunt as he paced the confines of his cheap hotel room. He was a fugitive stranded in a foreign land with a rapidly dwindling supply of cash and zero understanding of the local language. Back in North Carolina, his so-called partners in crime were living out a bizarre fantasy of unlimited wealth. Steve Chambers and Kelly Campbell had access to a mountain of money and zero self-control. Criminal masterminds usually understand the critical importance of laying low and laundering their illicit gains slowly over time. Steve Chambers was not a mastermind, but rather a petty criminal who suddenly believed he was royalty. He immediately abandoned his rusty trailer and purchased a sprawling luxury mansion in a highly exclusive neighborhood. He paid for the extravagant property entirely in cash, using stacks of small bills still wrapped in bank bands. The reckless spending spree did not stop at luxury real estate. The conspirators bought customized pickup trucks, expensive jewelry, and a bizarre velvet painting of Elvis Presley. They practically painted a giant target on their own backs for federal authorities to investigate. The Federal Bureau of Investigation did not need to deploy advanced forensic teams to track down the stolen millions. They simply followed the trail of incredibly loud and obnoxious purchases across the county. Agents quickly secured court-authorized wiretaps on the phones of Kelly Campbell and the Chambers residents. Listening to the recorded conversations was a masterclass in criminal incompetence. The conspirators openly discussed the stolen money, arguing constantly about how to divide the remaining fortune. They were blissfully unaware that every careless word was being transcribed by federal agents sitting in a surveillance van just down the street. The net was slowly closing in around the amateur syndicate. While Steve and Kelly enjoyed their newfound wealth, a dark realization began to settle over their extravagant lifestyle. David Gaunt was still alive in Mexico, and he represented a massive liability to their freedom. As long as he was breathing, there was a chance he could be captured and forced to testify against them. Steve decided that the mild-mannered vault guard who had made them rich was no longer useful. Steve Chambers coldly decided to sever the final tie to the Loomis Fargo vault. He hired a hitman named Michael McKinney to travel across the border and eliminate David permanently. McKinney was instructed to befriend the lonely fugitive and then execute him in a quiet location. The betrayal was absolute, reducing the man who had stolen $17 million to a mere loose end that needed to be violently clipped. In Cozumel, David was completely unaware that a contracted killer was hunting him under the tropical sun. He spent his days staring at the ocean, desperately waiting for Kelly to join him as she had promised. However, the phone calls from his supposed lover grew increasingly infrequent and remarkably cold. A creeping sense of paranoia began to replace the intoxicating thrill of the heist. The walls of his tropical paradise were rapidly closing in. Michael McKinney arrived in Mexico and smoothly integrated himself into the small expatriate community. He easily located David, who was desperately seeking any connection to his former life and country. The hitman played the role of a sympathetic friend, gaining the trust of the isolated and terrified fugitive. McKinney patiently waited for the perfect opportunity to strike, leading David further away from the safety of populated tourist areas. Back in the United States, federal agents listening to the wiretaps intercepted a chilling conversation. They heard Steve Chambers explicitly discussing the assassination plot and confirming that the hitman was already in position. The case immediately escalated from a massive financial crime to an imminent threat to human life. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had to act fast, forced into a desperate race against time to save the man they were trying to arrest. The investigation was no longer just about recovering the stolen millions of dollars. It was a chaotic scramble to coordinate with Mexican authorities and locate David before the assassin could pull the trigger. Agents worked frantically through the night, tracing phone records and dispatching international liaisons. The mild-mannered vault guard was about to discover the horrific truth about his criminal enterprise. The ultimate betrayal was hurtling towards him with lethal intent. The tropical breeze of Cozumel offered no solace as the net tightened around David Gaunt. He walked along the pristine shoreline, entirely oblivious to the lethal danger shadowing his every footstep. Michael McKinney, the hired assassin, watched him from a distance with cold calculation. The hitman was merely waiting for the perfect moment of isolation to execute his deadly contract and erase the final loose end of the Loomis Fargo heist. However, The Federal Bureau of Investigation had absolutely no intention of letting a massive financial crime escalate into a brutal murder. Working in unprecedented tandem with Mexican federal police, a massive tactical operation was launched into the heart of the tourist paradise. Heavily armed agents swarmed the sandy beaches and bustling streets, creating a perimeter of inescapable force. Their primary objective was no longer just the recovery of stolen currency, but the preservation of a human life. The takedown happened with blinding speed and overwhelming precision. Mexican authorities intercepted David just as he was wandering toward a secluded stretch of the coastline. He was thrown against the hood of a police cruiser, his mind racing with sheer terror and utter confusion. He firmly believed this was the absolute worst day of his entire existence, completely unaware that these officers had just saved him from a bullet to the back of the head. Simultaneously, the hitman Michael McKinney was quietly apprehended before he could draw his weapon. The immediate threat was neutralized, but the grand finale of the operation was just beginning thousands of miles away. In the wealthy suburbs of North Carolina, the extravagant fantasy world of Steve Chambers was about to violently shatter. Federal agents armed with battering rams and search warrants descended upon his newly purchased, cash-funded luxury mansion. The chaotic scene at the Chambers residence was a fitting end to their amateur criminal empire. Agents stormed through doors, discovering piles of shrink-wrapped Federal Reserve notes carelessly stashed in closets and under mattresses. The sheer audacity of their spending was matched only by their catastrophic lack of foresight. Steve was dragged out of his sprawling estate in handcuffs, his delusions of cartel grandeur instantly replaced by the grim reality of a federal indictment. Kelly Campbell was arrested shortly after, her manipulative charms entirely useless against the hardened federal investigators. The entire syndicate collapsed in a synchronized wave of law enforcement action that spanned across international borders. When David Gaunt was finally extradited back to American soil, he was placed in an interrogation room and confronted with the devastating truth. The agents played the wiretapped recordings of his supposed friends calmly plotting his brutal assassination. The profound betrayal hit David harder than the heavy steel doors of the vault he had emptied. He realized that his blinding infatuation had transformed him into nothing more than a disposable pawn in a ridiculously flawed game of greed. The woman he loved had sold his life for a pile of stolen paper. He immediately agreed to cooperate fully with the federal prosecution, eager to ensure that his betrayers faced the maximum possible justice. The subsequent criminal trials were a spectacular media circus that captivated the entire nation. The prosecution meticulously laid out the staggering incompetence of the conspirators, turning their grand heist into a dark national comedy. Steve Chambers received the harshest penalty, sentenced to over 11 years in federal prison for orchestrating the robbery and the attempted murder. Kelly Campbell was also sentenced to a lengthy prison term for her crucial role in the manipulative scheme. David Gaunt received a somewhat lighter sentence of roughly 7 years behind bars, a concession for his cooperation and the undeniable fact that he was manipulated. The federal authorities successfully recovered the vast majority of the $17 million, digging up plastic barrels full of cash buried in backyards. The Loomis Fargo company completely overhauled their internal security protocols, ensuring that a single employee could never again exercise solitary control over a major regional vault. The legacy of the 1997 heist endures